So in this second video on conscience, we're going to take a look at the role of conscience when making moral decisions about lying and adultery, and also overall the value of conscience as a moral guide. So what role does conscience play in making decisions about lying and adultery? It's important to note, first of all, that there are three main ways in which conscience could play a role when making decisions about anything, but specifically for our purposes around lying and adultery. So firstly, a person might consult the conscience before making any decisions about lying and adultery. Secondly, the conscience may lead people to conclude that their actions were right or wrong after lying or adultery, if they feel guilty or ashamed of themselves. Or thirdly, conscience may lead people to take particular actions in relation to lying and adultery. So, if people agree with the religious views that suggest the conscience is divinely inspired in some way, then we would really expect the conscience overall to play a significant role in their moral decision making. Of course, as critical thinkers, we should be questioning whether the voice they're really hearing is coming from God. They may think it's their conscience and they may think it's coming from God, but it's always worth reflecting on the evidence for that and the different views that are available. So what role does conscience play in making decisions about lying specifically? Let's talk first of all about the religious view of conscience. So Christians who consult the conscience when facing moral decisions about lying may find that they are led back to the teachings of divine law, such as from the Ten Commandments, you shall not bear false witness. However, they may also see support for lying to protect others in divine teachings about agapic love. Now, this is potentially to be expected given the teachings of the Catholic Church that emphasise that it is through his conscience that man sees and recognises the demands of divine law. So, in other words, the conscience is potentially just a tool that will lead you back to Scripture and what God has taught in Scripture. When making decisions about lying, Butler may presumably argue that Christians need to also ensure that they aren't corrupting their own conscience and talking themselves into a view that it is an acceptable thing to do when it really isn't. Now, in relation to the non-religious views, remember that Durkheim identified conscience with social conditioning. He suggested that if people have shared moral values, that will have a positive impact on society. So people who share Durkheim's perspective on the nature of conscience as collective may use the conscience to guide them to decide whether telling a lie in a specific situation could be acceptable to the wider society or not. For Freud, the conscience would come into play after an individual tells a lie. This would typically result in guilt stemming from the contravention of rules and regulations that stem from early childhood, where most children have been taught that telling lies is wrong by authority figures at home and at school. What role does conscience then play in making decisions about the second issue of adultery? The religious view of the conscience to start with, well, Christians who consult conscience when facing moral decisions about adultery may again find that they're led back to the teaching of divine laws, such as you shall not commit adultery. Given again that the Catholic Church has taught, it is through his conscience that man sees and recognises the demands of divine law. Cardinal Newman further wrote that we may feel ashamed or frightened at transgressing the voice of conscience. The prospect of this may actually encourage Christians to avoid committing adultery and would certainly lead to feelings of shame if they did. The non-religious views of conscience applied to adultery, again let's start with Durkheim. So Durkheim, remember, viewed conscience as social conditioning, and so would say that an action is bad if it's disapproved of by society. What's interesting about adultery is that in most Western societies, the attitudes on it have really shifted over the past few years. People have increasingly been turning away from religious teachings about sex outside of marriage and adultery, and they've become less taboo. One implication of this is that the conscience may not play a big role in making decisions about adultery for anybody who agrees with Durkheim's understanding of the conscience. However, based on Freud's views on conscience, it could still play a significant role. Remember that based on Freud's perspective, the superego or conscience absorbs the traditions of the family and the surrounding society and serves to control socially unacceptable impulses. Violation of the superego's standards results in feelings of guilt or anxiety and a need to atone for one's actions, and this may encourage people to think twice about making any decisions about having adultery, since, as Freud says, nothing can be hidden from the superego, not even thoughts. So let's move on now and think about the overall value of conscience as a moral guide. How valuable is it? Well, when evaluating the overall importance and usefulness of conscience as a guide for morality, it has to be said that the biggest problem is that there is no clear, widely accepted understanding of exactly what the conscience even is. Theologians, philosophers, psychologists, and sociologists understand conscience relative to their own disciplines, and so how valuable the conscience is will depend on which view of conscience is really being considered. However, it's important to note that within Christianity, conscience is overall viewed as a very important guide in terms of morality. Newman identified the conscience as the voice of God. The teachings of the Catholic Church refer to conscience as the secret core, where it's possible to be alone with God. So following the conscience for Christians means to follow divine will. Clearly then, it would be perceived by most Christians to be very useful as a guide for morality. However, being guided by the conscience does not necessarily mean that a person is doing what's right. This leads to questions about both the reliability of the conscience as a guide for morality and the implications for how people live their lives. Both Butler and Newman viewed conscience as somewhat intuitive, but to what extent can we trust that what is perceived as the voice of God really is the voice of God? Remember that Butler believes that human beings have the capacity to corrupt their own conscience, which further suggests that on its own, the conscience may not be a valuable moral guide at all. The teachings of the Catholic Church also emphasise the importance of continuing education for the conscience in order to ensure that it is correctly informed, which means again that overall it might not be the best moral guide if it's the only source of moral guidance that you use. In terms of the non-religious ideas about the conscience, Freud understood conscience as the superego, or the element of the mind that internalises the rules and regulations given to us by those in authority, especially our parents, to develop a non-rational guilty conscience. Now, feelings of guilt may help us to see that certain actions are wrong, but they may also be associated with aspects of ourselves that we are not able to change, such as sexuality, for example. Feelings of guilt may also not necessarily be related to morality either, which may lead us to question how valuable or useful the conscience really is as a moral guide. If conscience is understood in this way, it also suggests that it's not an alternative and different source of moral authority anyway, but rather is simply an echo from our childhood of the rules and regulations we've already learned from those in authority, which may lead us to further question how valuable it really is as a moral guide. Now, Durkheim, remember, identified conscience with social conditioning. He viewed it as a kind of survival mechanism and suggested that if people have shared moral values, it can have a positive impact on society. From this perspective, it can be argued that the conscience is important and does have value as a guide for morality. However, we have to question whether the perpetuation of shared moral values in society are always positive. Just look at that image there on the right and think about how that connects. In his work on the authoritarian conscience, Fromm argued that the rules that are put on us by external authorities such as parents, schools, and religious groups become part of ourselves. Again, this may lead us to question the value of the conscience as a moral guide, similar to the views of Freud. If it doesn't provide us with knowledge that we don't already know, then what is its value? Fromm further identified the humanistic conscience as the voice of our true self, which calls us to act productively to reach our potential based on intuitive knowledge of what is human and inhuman. Now, this leads to some of the same reliability questions as the intuitive religious ideas about the conscience. How can we know that what we identify as a voice of our true self is authentic and is not corrupted? Overall, can we rely on the conscience to guide us towards an understanding of what is right and wrong? Well, guilt is probably the most common feeling an individual feels when they disobey their conscience. Beliefs about the origins of this guilt may differ based on the perspective taken about the nature of conscience, but there are some similarities to be found between the religious and the non-religious perspectives. If social norms dictate that homosexuality, for example, is wrong, and our conscience is developed by the internalization of social norms, then our conscience might well say that homosexuality is wrong. If, however, this is questioned, we may opt to change our position on the issue, which would lead us to disobey our conscience, limiting its value as a moral guide. Of course, our conscience would change as our thinking changes, but in the initial stages, disobedience would be inevitable. Some Christians could also prioritize scripture over their conscience. So, using the homosexuality example, the conscience may consider homosexuality to be morally acceptable. However, as scripture takes the opposite view in places, some Christians could follow what the Bible teaches over what their conscience is telling them to do, limiting the value of the conscience as a moral guide. If it's considered that human beings are given free will, then we have the freedom to choose to disobey our conscience, or at least not to follow it blindly, which also again further would limit its value as a moral guide. So overall, there are many different views about the nature of conscience, and for the A-level RS exam, you need to know a selection of views that are both religious and non-religious. For each one, whichever you choose to study, make sure you think about the value it may have in moral decision making and how it could be used when making decisions about lying and adultery.